sharp crack of a gunshot echoed across the barren landscape, startling a pair of vultures from their perch on a withered mesquite. The merciless Arizona sun beat down on the desert floor, turning the earth into a furnace that scorched everything it touched. And there, stretched out on that blistering ground, a young woman lay bound, her wrists and ankles secured to iron stakes driven deep into the hard-packed dirt. Her skin was burned an angry red, her lips cracked and bleeding. The tattered remains of her once blue dress clung to her body, darkened with sweat and dust. Each shallow breath seemed to cost her dearly, as if the very air around her had turned to fire. They say that in Rattlesnake Gulch back in 1877, Sheriff Mason Cole's brand of justice was nothing more than hatred wrapped in a silver badge. From the ridge overlooking this grim scene, a solitary figure watched, the brim of his hat pulled low against the glare. Jackson Blackwood had ridden into these parts seeking nothing more than supplies and solitude. At 45, the lines etched into his weathered face spoke of battles fought and losses endured. A man who had seen too much and said too little. The sun glinted off the worn Remington 1875 that hung at his hip, a revolver he'd carried since his days fighting for the Union. 6 chambers, 6 bullets, and a grip carved with the names Rebecca and Thomas, the wife and son he'd buried after road agents had left them for dead while he was away trading cattle. That was 5 years ago. And since then, Blackwood had chosen the company of horses and hard work over that of people and their complications. Dismounting from his chestnut stallion, Blackwood reached for his canteen. The water inside was warm, but still wet. That was all that mattered out here, where men died for less. He took a swig, then wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, his eyes never leaving the young woman below. A cluster of townsfolk stood nearby, their backs turned as they headed back to Rattlesnake Gulch. Some hung their heads as they walked, shame evident in their slumped shoulders. Others strode with purpose, as if they'd just witnessed justice rather than cruelty. Blackwood had heard rumors about this place, a mining town where the gold had started to run dry and desperation had set in. A town ruled by a man who'd appointed himself judge, jury, and executioner. A place where accusations were as good as proof, and where the desert law meant 3 days staked under the burning sun. Survive, and you're innocent. Die, and your guilt is proven. It was the kind of law made by men who confuse fear with respect. Blackwood spat into the dirt. He'd seen enough. He hadn't come looking for trouble, but some things a man couldn't ride away from. Not if he wanted to sleep at night. Gripping his canteen tightly, he began making his way down the rocky slope. The woman's eyes fluttered open as Blackwood's shadow fell across her face. For a moment, there was only fear in her gaze, then a desperate hope as she realized he wasn't one of them. She tried to speak, but her parched throat produced only a raspy whisper. "Please, untie me." Blackwood knelt beside her, uncorking his canteen. Gently he lifted her head, bringing the water to her cracked lips. "Easy now," he murmured. "Small sips." She drank, coughing as the water hit her raw throat. When she'd had enough, Blackwood set the canteen aside and reached for the hunting knife at his belt. "Name's Jackson Blackwood," he said, sawing at the rope binding her right wrist. "What did they say you did?" "Stole gold," she managed, her voice stronger now but still barely above a whisper. "From the town storehouse. But I didn't. I swear I didn't." The rope gave way and her arm fell limply to her side. Blackwood moved to her other wrist. "Sarah Mitchell," she said. "My father was a miner. Died in a cave-in last winter." Blackwood nodded, focusing on the rope. As the second binding came loose, he caught a flash of movement from the corner of his eye. 4 riders approached from the direction of town, dust rising behind them like an angry spirit. "We've got company," he muttered, cutting faster at the ropes around her ankles. The riders pulled up 20 yards away, their horses snorting and stamping. At their lead was a thin man with a pock-marked face and eyes like a rattler's, cold, unblinking, dangerous. "Well now," the man called out, his voice carrying across the dry air. "Seems like we got ourselves a good Samaritan." He spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the ground. "Name's Billy Jenkins. Folks round here call me Rattlesnake." Blackwood severed the last rope and helped Sarah to a sitting position. Without taking his eyes off Jenkins, he replied, "Folks call me many things. None of 'em matter much out here," Jenkins sneered. "That there is town property you're tampering with, mister. Sheriff Cole's orders." Blackwood stood slowly, positioning himself between Sarah and the riders. "Last I checked, people ain't property, and tying women to stakes ain't law." "It is in Rattlesnake Gulch," Jenkins said, his hand hovering near his holster. 3 days under God's eye. That's our way." Behind Blackwood, Sarah struggled to her feet, swaying slightly. He could feel her grip the back of his coat for support. "Your way is just an excuse for cowards to torment the weak," Blackwood said, his voice level but carrying an edge sharp enough to cut. "Now I'm taking this woman to get proper care, and anyone who tries to stop me is going to have a real bad day." Jenkins's face twisted into an ugly grin. "There's 4 of us and 1 of you, old man." "I count 4 mistakes about to happen," Blackwood replied. For 3 heartbeats, nobody moved. Then Jenkins went for his gun. Blackwood's Remington cleared leather in a fluid motion born of years of practice. His first shot caught Jenkins' right-hand man square in the chest before the man's pistol was even halfway drawn. The second rider managed to get off a wild shot that whistled past Blackwood's ear before Blackwood's second bullet found its mark in the man's shoulder, spinning him from his saddle. Jenkins and his remaining man fired simultaneously. Blackwood dropped to one knee, pulling Sarah down with him. The bullets passed harmlessly overhead as Blackwood squeezed off 2 more shots in rapid succession. The third rider clutched his gut and toppled from his horse, while Jenkins howled in pain as Blackwood's bullet shattered his gun hand. Dropping his ruined Colt, Jenkins yanked his horse around with his good hand and spurred it hard, abandoning his fallen companions as he galloped back toward town. Blackwood rose, scanning the area to ensure no further threats. The entire exchange had lasted less than 15 seconds. "Can you ride?" he asked Sarah, helping her to her feet again. She nodded weakly. "I think so." "Good," he said, guiding her toward his horse, "'cause we need to put some distance between us and this place before Jenkins brings back reinforcements." As he helped her into the saddle, Blackwood's weathered face betrayed no emotion, but his mind was already calculating. Jenkins would ride straight to Sheriff Cole. They'd come in force next time, and when they did, Blackwood would need more than just his Remington and steady hands. He needed allies, and he knew just where to find one. Copper Canyon lay 15 miles to the west of Rattlesnake Gulch, far enough to be outside Cole's influence, but close enough to reach before Sarah's condition worsened. The town had started as a copper mining operation, but had grown into a respectable settlement with a doctor, a general store, and most importantly, a federal marshal's office. The sun was dipping toward the horizon when Blackwood guided his tired horse down the main street. Sarah, who had drifted in and out of consciousness during the ride, stirred as they passed under the wooden archway that marked the town limits. "Where are we?" she mumbled. "Somewhere safe," Blackwood assured her. "Got an old friend here who might help us." He pulled up outside a whitewashed building with U.S. Marshal painted in bold letters across his front. Dismounting, he lifted Sarah carefully from the saddle and carried her up the steps. Inside, a gray-haired man with a thick mustache looked up from his desk, eyes widening as he took in the newcomers. He rose quickly, pushing aside the paperwork he'd been studying. "Jack Blackwood," he said, a mix of surprise and concern in his voice. "Been a few years." "Too many, Frank," Blackwood replied. "This here's Sarah Mitchell. She needs a doctor and protection." Marshal Frank Morgan didn't waste time with questions. He crossed to the door, calling to a deputy outside. "Get Doc Johnson. Tell him it's urgent." Turning back to Blackwood, he gestured to a cot in the corner of the office. "Set her down there. Then you can tell me what kind of hornet's nest you've kicked over this time." Within the hour, Sarah was under Doc Johnson's care in a room behind the marshal's office, and Blackwood sat across from Morgan, a glass of whiskey in hand. He'd relayed the day's events in his characteristic sparse style, letting the facts speak for themselves. Morgan leaned back in his chair, his weathered face grim. "Mason Cole," he muttered. "That bastard's been a thorn in my side for years, but I've never had enough to move on him officially." Blackwood raised an eyebrow. "Thought federal marshals outranked local sheriffs." "It's complicated," Morgan sighed. "Cole's got connections. Railroad investors, territory officials. They turn a blind eye to his methods because he keeps the peace, such as it is." The marshal took a long pull from his whiskey. "But there's more to it than that. I've had reports of gold shipments going missing, miners turning up dead. Seems Cole's running a smuggling operation across the border into Mexico." "And Sarah?" Blackwood asked. "Probably saw something she shouldn't have," Morgan speculated. "Cole wouldn't risk the desert law unless she posed a real threat." The door opened, and Doc Johnson entered, wiping his hands on a cloth. Though only in his 40s, the physician's hair had gone prematurely white, giving him the appearance of a man who had seen more suffering than most. "She'll pull through," Johnson reported. "Dehydration, sunburn, some rope burns on her wrists and ankles. Nothing permanent, but she's lucky you found her when you did, Mr. Blackwood. Another day out there." He let the implication hang in the air. "She's awake," the doctor continued, "asking to speak with you both." In the small back room, Sarah sat propped up on pillows, her face and arms coated with a soothing salve that gave off the smell of aloe. When Blackwood and Morgan entered, she tried to sit up straighter. "Thank you," she said to Blackwood, her voice stronger now. "You saved my life." Blackwood nodded once, uncomfortable with gratitude. "You mentioned something about gold," he prompted. Sarah's expression darkened. "After my father died, I took a job at Hollister's General Store. I kept the books." Her hands twisted in the blanket. "Last month I noticed discrepancies in the supply ledgers. Items being ordered but never hitting the shelves. Payments made to names I didn't recognize." She looked up at Morgan. "When I asked Mr. Hollister about it, he got nervous, told me to forget what I'd seen. But the next day I found a hidden account book. It showed payments to Sheriff Cole and references to gold shipments. The day after that, Cole arrested me, said I'd stolen gold from the town storehouse. No trial, just his word against mine." Her voice trembled. "They dragged me out at dawn and staked me to the ground. Cole told everyone I'd be a lesson in what happens to thieves." Morgan and Blackwood exchanged looks. "Those ledgers would be evidence," Morgan said. "Enough for me to bring in federal agents." "They're still at the store," Sarah confirmed. "Hidden in a false bottom of the flour barrel in the storeroom?" Blackwood drained his whiskey. "So we go get them." "Not that simple," Morgan cautioned. "By now, Cole knows Sarah's gone. He'll have men watching every approach to town." A knock at the office door interrupted them. Morgan excused himself, returning moments later with a swarthy, well-dressed man. "This is Miguel Vasquez," Morgan introduced him. "Merchant from Sonora. Been helping me track the smuggling routes." Vasquez bowed slightly. "Marshal Morgan says you have had an encounter with Sheriff Cole. This is fortunate timing. My sources tell me Cole is planning a major shipment 2 nights from now. 500 pounds of stolen gold, bound for Mexico." Morgan's eyes narrowed. "If we can catch him in the act—" "We'll need those ledgers first," Blackwood cut in. "Hard evidence." The marshal nodded slowly. "We'll need a plan. Cole's office will be guarded. But if we can get those ledgers from the store—" As the men began discussing strategy, Sarah watched Blackwood. There was something in his eyes she recognized, a pain that matched her own, but older, deeper. A man who had lost something precious and never quite found his way back. "Why are you helping me?" she asked quietly when the others had moved to the main office to consult a map. Blackwood was silent for so long that Sarah thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "Some things a man can't ride away from." It wasn't much of an answer, but somehow it was enough. The moon hung like a silver dollar in the night sky, casting just enough light for Blackwood and Morgan to make their way through the shadows of Rattlesnake Gulch. They had left their horses a mile outside town and approached on foot, avoiding the main roads. Blackwood's Remington sat ready in its holster, fully loaded with fresh ammunition. On his other hip, a Bowie knife gleamed dully in the moonlight. Morgan carried a Winchester repeater in addition to his Colt Peacemaker, firepower they hoped wouldn't be needed, but were ready to use. The plan was simple but risky: retrieve the ledgers from Hollister's store, then search Cole's office for additional evidence of the smuggling operation. If they were lucky, they'd be in and out before anyone knew they were there. Luck, however, had never been something Blackwood counted on. Hollister's general store stood dark and silent at the edge of the town square. A single oil lamp burned in the window of the sheriff's office across the way, suggesting at least one deputy was on duty. Otherwise, the town seemed quiet, most of its residents having retired for the night. Morgan kept watch while Blackwood worked on the store's back door, his skilled fingers making quick work of the simple lock. Years of opening stubborn gates and mending complex tack had given him a touch most wouldn't expect from a man with such calloused hands. The door swung open with a faint creak. Blackwood froze, listening for any response, then slipped inside with Morgan close behind. The interior was pitch black, but Sarah had described the layout in detail. Moving carefully between barrels and shelves, they made their way to the storeroom. The flour barrel stood exactly where Sarah had said it would be. Blackwood lifted the lid, plunged his hand deep into the flour, and felt around until his fingers found the edge of a false bottom. Lifting it carefully, he extracted a leather-bound ledger. "This it?" Morgan whispered, striking a match to see. Blackwood nodded as the pages revealed columns of figures, dates, and coded entries. "This'll put Cole away for a long time." The match went out, plunging them back into darkness. "Sheriff's office next," Morgan murmured. "We need to know where that shipment's heading." They retraced their steps through the silent store and slipped out into the night. The sheriff's office was more challenging. A deputy dozed at the front desk, keys to the cells hanging from his belt. The back window, however, had been left open a crack to catch the night breeze. Morgan gave Blackwood a boost, and the rancher pulled himself through the narrow opening with the quiet efficiency of a man used to physical labor. Once inside, he eased the window open further to allow Morgan to follow. Cole's private office was locked, but the key hung on a hook behind the deputy's desk. Moving like shadows, they retrieved it and slipped into the inner sanctum of Rattlesnake Gulch's corrupt law. Inside, Blackwood struck a match, illuminating a space that told them much about Mason Cole. A fine desk carved from mahogany, a cabinet filled with expensive liquor, a Winchester rifle with silver inlay hanging on the wall. Not the trappings of a sheriff's salary, but of a man with other sources of income. Morgan began searching through the desk drawers while Blackwood examined a map of the territory pinned to the wall. Red marks indicated mines both active and abandoned. One abandoned mine, 20 miles south, had been circled heavily in ink. "Frank," Blackwood whispered, pointing to the map. "Bet that's where they're moving the gold from." Morgan joined him, nodding as he studied the location. Old Crawford Mine, played out years ago, but it'd make a perfect staging area. He turned back to the desk. "Look at this." He held up a document detailing shipments and payments. Names, dates, amounts, all carefully recorded in Cole's meticulous hand. The fool kept records, Morgan said, a note of satisfaction in his voice, detailed ones. Smart men often make that mistake, Blackwood replied. They think they're too clever to get caught. The click of a revolver's hammer being cocked froze them both. Speaking of getting caught, came a cold voice from the doorway. Sheriff Mason Cole stood there, his silver star gleaming on his chest. His cold army pointed steadily at them. A tall man with silver at his temples and eyes like chips of blue ice. Cole had the bearing of someone used to being obeyed without question. Marshal Morgan, Cole drawled. A bit outside your jurisdiction, aren't you? And you must be the hero who interfered with town business today. His cold gaze fixed on Blackwood. I don't believe we've been properly introduced. Mason, Morgan said evenly, you're finished. We have the ledgers. We know about the smuggling operation. Cole's smile never reached his eyes. What I know is that I have 2 trespassers in my office in the middle of the night. Looks like a hanging offense to me. He raised his voice slightly. Jenkins! The deputy who had been dozing at the desk appeared behind Cole, his gun already drawn despite his bandaged hand. His face darkened with recognition and hatred when he saw Blackwood. You 2 are going to drop those weapons nice and slow, Cole ordered. Then we're going to have a long talk about how you're going to disappear without a trace. Blackwood's eyes flicked to Morgan, a silent communication passing between them. Morgan gave an almost imperceptible nod. In one fluid motion, Blackwood dropped the ledger and kicked over the desk lamp. Glass shattered, oil spilled, and flames erupted as Blackwood dove to the side. Cole fired, the bullet splintering the desk where Blackwood had stood a moment before. Morgan brought up his Colt, squeezing off 2 shots that sent Jenkins scrambling for cover. Blackwood rolled behind the desk, drawing his Remington as he moved. He came up firing, forcing Cole back through the doorway. The window, Morgan shouted, grabbing the incriminating documents from the desk as flames began to lick up the curtains. Blackwood provided covering fire as Morgan scrambled through the window. A bullet grazed Blackwood's arm as he followed, pain flaring hot along his bicep. They hit the ground running, gunfire erupting behind them as Cole and his men gave chase. Split up, Morgan called as they reached an alley. Meet at the rendezvous. I've got the evidence. Blackwood nodded, breaking right while Morgan went left. The sound of pursuit followed him as he weaved through the maze of buildings. A bullet thudded into a wall beside his head, showering him with splinters. 2 deputies rounded the corner ahead. Blackwood fired twice, not aiming to kill, but to discourage. One deputy went down clutching his leg. The other dove for cover. Blackwood pressed on, his breathing controlled despite the exertion. At the edge of town, he paused behind a water trough, checking his ammunition. 4 shots fired, 2 left. He reloaded quickly from the spare cartridges in his pocket, then peered around the corner. The street appeared empty, but instinct told him danger lurked nearby. Years of surviving hadn't dulled his senses. If anything, they'd grown sharper. A flicker of movement caught his eye, the barrel of a rifle protruding from a second-story window. Blackwood dropped flat as the shot rang out, feeling the bullet pass through the space where his head had been. Rolling to his feet, he sprinted across the open ground toward the cover of a nearby stable. More shots followed, kicking up dust at his heels. Inside the stable, he found what he needed, a horse already saddled. Some cowboy's bad luck was his good fortune. Mounting up, Blackwood burst from the stable's back door, spurring the animal hard toward the open desert. Behind him, shouts and gunfire faded as distance grew between him and Rattlesnake Gulch. His arm throbbed where the bullet had grazed him, but it wasn't serious. More concerning was not knowing if Morgan had escaped with the evidence. They'd arranged to rendezvous at an abandoned line shack 10 miles outside of town if they got separated. All Blackwood could do now was ride and hope his old friend had made it out alive. What he didn't know was that back in Copper Canyon, Sarah Mitchell was already in danger. Cole, cunning as a desert fox, had dispatched riders to the neighboring town as soon as he'd learned where Blackwood had taken her. While Blackwood and Morgan had been sneaking into Rattlesnake Gulch, Cole's men had been closing in on their safe house. By the time Blackwood reached the rendezvous point, he would discover that the stakes had been raised considerably. This was no longer just about evidence and justice. It had become a matter of life and death. Dawn broke over the desert, painting the landscape in shades of pink and gold. Blackwood sat in the shadow of the line shack, his back against the rough wooden wall, the stolen horse grazing nearby. His wounded arm had been bandaged with a strip torn from his shirt, the blood already dried to a rusty brown. He'd been waiting for hours, watching the horizon for any sign of Morgan. The marshal should have reached the rendezvous long before now. Something had gone wrong. Rising stiffly, Blackwood checked his Remington one last time before mounting up. He had a bad feeling in his gut, the kind that had kept him alive through years of danger. It told him now that he needed to get back to Copper Canyon, fast. The sun was high by the time he rode into town, immediately noticing the unusual stillness. No one moved on the streets, and shutters were drawn tight over windows. It was the quiet of a town holding its breath. Blackwood dismounted outside the marshal's office, his spurs jangling in the eerie silence. The door stood partially open, and he pushed it wider, his Remington drawn and ready. Inside, the scene confirmed his worst fears. The office had been ransacked, papers scattered across the floor. Blood stained the worn floorboards. A lot of blood. But there was no sign of Morgan, Doc Johnson, or Sarah. A soft groan drew his attention to a corner where a young deputy lay slumped, a bloodied bandage wrapped around his head. Blackwood knelt beside him. "What happened?" he demanded. "Where's the marshal? Where's the girl?" The deputy's eyes fluttered open, unfocused from pain. "Cole's men," he whispered. 8, maybe 10 of them. Came at first light." He coughed weakly. "Took the girl. Said the marshal had 6 hours to bring them the ledgers, or she dies. And Morgan went after them, told me to tell you they took her to Rattlesnake Gulch. Said you'd know what to do." Blackwood's jaw tightened. Of course Cole would make his stand there, where he controlled every aspect of the playing field. Morgan was walking into a trap, probably knew it, but had gone anyway. The marshal wouldn't sacrifice an innocent, even if it meant his own life. "How long ago?" Blackwood asked. 3 hours, maybe 4, the deputy replied. "Mr. Blackwood, they had a lot of guns." Blackwood nodded grimly. "So do I." He rose and moved to Morgan's gun cabinet, which had been left untouched in the chaos. Inside were extra ammunition, a second Colt revolver, and a sawed-off shotgun. Blackwood took them all. In the street, he encountered Miguel Vasquez, emerging cautiously from the hotel across the way. "Senor Blackwood," the Mexican called, "I saw what happened but could not help. They had too many men. I need a fresh horse and information," Blackwood said without preamble. "How many men does Cole have? Where would he hold the girl?" "Perhaps 15 gunmen," Vasquez replied. "As for the girl, Cole uses the old bank vault for prisoners. It has only one entrance, heavily guarded." He hesitated. "There is something else. My cousin works in Cole's stables. He says Cole plans to move the gold tonight, earlier than expected." He grows nervous. Blackwood processed this information quickly. Cole was accelerating his plans, which meant he was feeling pressure. That could make him more dangerous, but also more prone to mistakes. "I need you to get word to the federal authorities in Tucson," Blackwood told Vasquez. "Tell them everything, the smuggling, the kidnapping, all of it. But it'll take them at least a day to get here, and Sarah doesn't have that long." "What will you do?" Vasquez asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. "What needs doing?" Blackwood replied simply. Within the hour, Blackwood was riding toward Rattlesnake Gulch on a fresh horse, his mind focused on the task ahead. Cole would expect him to come charging in, guns blazing. That's exactly what he wouldn't do. The sun was beginning its westward descent when he left his horse hidden in a dry wash a mile outside town. On foot, he made his way to a ridge that overlooked Rattlesnake Gulch from the south, opposite the direction from which Morgan would have approached. Through a battered spyglass, he surveyed the town. Armed men patrolled the streets, far more than usual for a settlement this size. The old bank building stood at the center of town, two guards posted at its entrance. Cole himself paced on the porch of the sheriff's office, occasionally barking orders at men who scurried to obey. No sign of Morgan or Sarah. They were being held somewhere out of sight, the vault most likely, as Vasquez had suggested. Getting to them would require creating a diversion, something to draw Cole's men away from the bank. As Blackwood watched, a wagon loaded with wooden crates pulled up outside the sheriff's office, the gold shipment being prepared for transport. Cole inspected the cargo briefly before ordering it moved behind the building. Blackwood smiled grimly. Cole had just handed him the perfect diversion. Night fell over Rattlesnake Gulch like a heavy blanket, bringing with it a cool breeze that rustled through the scrub brush. Blackwood moved silently through the shadows at the edge of town, a dark figure indistinguishable from the night around him. The sawed-off shotgun was slung across his back, both revolvers holstered at his hips, and additional ammunition filled his pockets. He carried a small leather pouch as well, containing items borrowed from a Chinese laundryman in Copper Canyon, black powder wrapped in paper twists. Blackwood reached the rear of the sheriff's office unseen. The wagon sat unattended, its precious cargo covered with a tarp. The guards were focused outward, watching for an attack from outside the town, not from within. Working quickly, Blackwood placed the paper twist beneath the wagon, creating a fuse that led to a nearby water trough. Then he melted back into the darkness, circling around to position himself closer to the bank. From his hiding place between two buildings, he had a clear view of both the bank and the sheriff's office. Taking careful aim with the Remington, he fired a single shot at a lantern hanging outside the saloon. The glass shattered, the oil ignited, and flames began to lick up the wooden support post. Shouts of "Fire!" rang out, drawing attention away from both the bank and the sheriff's office. As men rushed to battle the blaze, Blackwood touched a match to the fuse he'd created. The explosion that followed was more impressive than he'd anticipated. The wagon erupted in a ball of fire, sending burning debris and gold bars in all directions. The night lit up as bright as day for a moment, and the shock wave could be felt even where Blackwood crouched. Chaos erupted. Men ran in all directions, some toward the explosion, others away from it. Cole emerged from his office, roaring orders that went unheeded in the pandemonium. Blackwood seized the moment, dashing across the open ground to the bank building. One guard remained at the door, his attention fixed on the burning sheriff's office. Blackwood clubbed him from behind with the butt of his revolver, catching the unconscious man and easing him to the ground. Inside, the bank was dark except for a single lamp burning on a desk. Another guard turned at Blackwood's entrance, reaching for his gun. Blackwood was faster, his shot taking the man in the shoulder and spinning him into the wall. "Where's the vault?" Blackwood demanded, pressing the barrel of his Remington against the wounded guard's throat. "Downstairs," the man gasped. "Through the door behind the counter." Blackwood knocked him unconscious with a swift blow, then vaulted over the counter. The door was locked, but a few powerful kicks splintered the wood around the latch. A narrow staircase led down to a basement level where the vault door stood partially open. Inside, Blackwood found Sarah bound to a chair, her eyes wide with fear until she recognized him. Marshal Morgan lay on the floor nearby, bloodied but conscious. "About time," Morgan croaked as Blackwood cut Sarah free. "Was starting to think you'd forgotten about us." "Had to make an entrance," Blackwood replied, helping the marshal to his feet. "Town's a bit distracted at the moment. Cole's gold shipment just went up in flames." Morgan managed a weak grin despite his injuries. That ought to ruin his day. They made their way up the stairs, Blackwood supporting Morgan while Sarah followed close behind. Outside, Rattlesnake Gulch had descended into complete chaos. The fire had spread from the sheriff's office to adjacent buildings, and men worked frantically to contain the blaze. The explosion had scattered gold bars across the street, and some of the townsfolk were more interested in gathering the precious metal than in fighting the fire. "This way," Blackwood directed, guiding them toward a side street that would lead them out of town. They had almost reached the edge of the buildings when a voice rang out behind them. "That's far enough, Blackwood." Sheriff Mason Cole stood in the middle of the street, his face illuminated by the glow of the burning buildings. His silver star gleamed on his chest, and his Colt was leveled at them with deadly precision. Billy Jenkins stood at his side along with two other deputies. "I underestimated you," Cole admitted, his voice carrying easily over the distant shouts. "Won't make that mistake again." Blackwood gently pushed Sarah behind him, his eyes never leaving Cole's. "It's over, Cole. The federal authorities know everything. That gold you've been smuggling? It's evidence now, scattered all over your street." Cole's face twisted with rage. "I built this town," he snarled. "Everything I did was to keep it alive after the mines started failing. These people would be starving if not for me." "Save it for the judge," Morgan called out, his voice stronger now. "If you live that long." Cole's eyes narrowed. "I'm not going to prison, Morgan, and neither of you is leaving this town alive." He nodded to his men. "Kill them." What followed happened so quickly that later, when Sarah tried to describe it, she found words inadequate. Blackwood seemed to move before Cole had finished speaking. His first shot caught Jenkins square in the chest, dropping him instantly. His second struck one of the deputies in the arm, causing the man's own shot to go wide. Morgan, despite his injuries, managed to draw and fire at the second deputy, the bullet finding its mark. Cole fired at Blackwood, the bullet grazing his cheek and drawing a line of blood. Blackwood didn't flinch, continuing his advance as he fired his third shot. Cole staggered but remained standing, raising his gun for another attempt. Sarah, seeing Cole about to fire again, acted on instinct. She rushed forward, driving her shoulder into the back of Cole's knees. The sheriff's legs buckled, his shot going high as he crashed to the ground. Blackwood was on him in an instant, kicking Cole's gun away and pressing the barrel of his Remington against the sheriff's forehead. "Give me a reason," Blackwood said, his voice deadly quiet. "Just one." For a moment it seemed Cole might still defy him. Then slowly the fight went out of him. The great Sheriff Mason Cole, terror of Rattlesnake Gulch, sagged in defeat. By the time full order was restored, dawn was breaking over the desert once more. Federal agents had arrived from Tucson, summoned by Vasquez as Blackwood had requested. They took custody of Cole and his surviving men, along with the scattered gold that served as evidence of the smuggling operation. The townsfolk, many of whom had suffered under Cole's harsh rule, gathered in the town square. Some looked lost, uncertain what would become of them now. Others seemed relieved, as if a great weight had been lifted. Marshal Morgan, his wounds tended by Doc Johnson, who had ridden in with the federal agents, addressed the crowd. Though still weak, he stood tall, his voice carrying authority. "Justice isn't about tying innocent people to stakes in the desert," he told them. "It's about those who break the law facing consequences for their actions, no matter who they are." The townsfolk nodded, some with shame, others with dawning hope. Among them stood Sarah Mitchell, her resilience evident in the straight set of her shoulders despite all she had endured. "What happens now?" one old miner called out. "You rebuild," Morgan answered. "You choose better leaders. You make this a town where law means justice, not fear." As the crowd dispersed, Sarah approached Blackwood, who stood apart, watching the proceedings with a distant expression. "Will you stay?" she asked. "Rattlesnake Gulch could use someone like you." Blackwood's weathered face softened slightly as he looked at her. She reminded him of what he'd lost. Not a replacement, nothing could replace his family, but perhaps a reason to stop running from the memory. I'm not much for towns, he said slowly, but my ranch is only a few days' ride from here. Good land. Too much for one man. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Could use some help getting it back in proper order. Sarah smiled, understanding what he was offering. Not romance, but family. A chance to belong somewhere again, for both of them. I'd like that, she said simply. Morgan joined them, leaning heavily on a cane. So Jack Blackwood settling down again? Never thought I'd see the day. Blackwood shrugged. Man can't outrun his shadow forever. As they walked together toward the edge of town where fresh horses waited, Blackwood felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The weight on his shoulders seemed lighter. The names carved in his Remington's grip would always be there, but perhaps now they could be a reminder of what he'd had, not just what he'd lost. In the harshest desert, sometimes hope takes root when you least expect it. And for Jackson Blackwood, the road ahead no longer stretched empty into the distance. For the first time in 5 long years, he wasn't riding alone.